So we'll be talking today about religion and politics through the lens of social and political psychology. And social psychology, those of you who haven't taken social psychology, can be summed up in various ways, but the definition that I sort of pull from my hat is it's looking at the influences of others, of other people, on people's thoughts, attitudes, behaviors, the way in which we receive the influences of others in what we think and what we do, essentially. And political psychology is studying these sorts of processes at a level where you're trying to understand what drives people to have certain political positions or to take certain political stands or engage in certain kinds of political action. So when you're talking about religion and politics, these are huge social influences on all of us that sometimes we're aware of and sometimes we're not aware of. And so I want to explore some of the things that are going on in religion and politics. I like this. I want to sort of start with this cute little quote from Gilbert, W.S. Gilbert, of a famous pair most of you probably don't know, called Gilbert and Sullivan. They did a lot of sort of comedic plays and quasi-operatic musical numbers. And this line is, I often think it's comical how nature always does contrive that every boy and every gal that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or a little conservative, fa-la-la. And what I like about fa-la-la, that particular touch on the end, is suggests that this is all kind of a bad joke. The idea of thinking of everyone as either falling into the category of liberal or conservative may be somewhat absurd. So I'm going to start with kind of common ideas that liberals and conservatives have towards themselves and towards each other. This is sort of a typical view of a conservative view of conservatism. Conservatism is like Superman. It's like rescuing everyone from evil. And this is a liberal's view of conservatism. You probably can't see this, but at the bottom it should say conservatism. It's kind of like this freakish cat. That's a liberal's view of conservatism. This is a liberal's view of liberalism. And this is sort of an academic or a dictionary definition of liberalism. One who is generous, one who favors greater freedom in political and religious matters, suggests one is free from prejudice or narrow thinking, and the antonyms or the opposite of liberal is stingy, mean, bigoted, or conservative. So this is a liberal's view of liberalism. And a conservative view of liberalism looks a little bit more like this. Liberals kind of like the bogeyman, but they don't go away when the lights are on. So these are very sort of negative views that I'm finding out here in my Google image searches of liberals and conservatives, the attitudes that they have towards each other. And you can find similar negative attitudes about the way religions are represented. So here's a sort of uncharitable view of religious types. You can't see it at the bottom here, but it says, we aren't perfect, we're just better than you. And then this is an uncharitable view of non-religious types. It says, imagine a world without organized atheism. And it has a bunch of communist dictators up there. So these are not very kindly views of sort of religion or irreligious types coming from both angles. And then here is an uncharitable view of those who have uncharitable views. I'm a little bit closer to this view. So here's a little cartoon. Someone says, personally, I find atheists just as annoying as fundamentalist Christians. And then the retort is, well, the important thing is you found a way to feel superior to both. And that seems to be what's often going on, is that people feel like whatever perspective they take on is the superior perspective. They look at the people who have a different perspective as being inferior in some way for failing to realize whatever we've realized that's allowed us to arrive at our worldview. So I would hope that this lecture will direct us eventually to this view from Mark Twain, which is that the easy confidence with which we know another man's religion is folly teaches me to suspect that my own is also. If you find yourself dismayed by what everybody else believes, then that dismay could potentially boomerang onto whatever it is you believe, because chances are you believe your beliefs for reasons that are about as unjustified as the reasons people believe their beliefs. So we'll be looking through this and see how this plays out in the psychological arena. Part of the issue here is, you can even see from some of these Google images, is that people are saying liberals are bad or conservatives are bad, conservatives are freakish cat, liberals are the bogeyman, and they're not really saying what either of them are. And it's not clear that anyone really knows. A lot of the time, people say they're liberal or they say they're conservative or they say they're religious or not religious, and then you kind of probe people about what they mean by that. And they often kind of say a variety of different things. So there's a kind of ambiguity around even knowing what we mean when we talk about whether we're liberal or conservative. And I would go so far as to say that religion and ideology are kind of slippery beasts. We think we know what we're talking about, then we try to grasp hold of it, it slips out of our hands. This is a little slippery pig event that used to be a popular thing in, presume, the Middle Ages. So for me, I find that trying to understand ideology is kind of like playing the slippery pig game. Just when you feel like you've got some sort of grasp of it, it slips out of your hands and it shows you something that you wouldn't expect it to show you. So I'll be looking at some of those unexpected turns in our expectations around religion and ideology here. So one of the questions that is a question that everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people struggle with as they come to adolescence, or as they sort of realize that it's important to have some kind of a moral orientation to the world, is, should I become a religious person like all the other people I see around, a lot of the people I see around me who are religious, or should I be a non-religious person like a lot of the people who I see who are not religious? And if I'm going to be religious, what kind of religion should I be? These are questions that occur to a lot of people, and trying to find your way to the answers is sort of a difficult task. And part of the problem, I think, is that people don't always know what it means to be religious in the first place, so they don't know what they'd be rejecting if they were to reject that. And also the idea of better is not something that people are necessarily 100% on. What's good is something that we're also struggling to figure out on some level. And finding out where we want to put our values, what we want to say is worthwhile and what's not worthwhile. This is sort of a life struggle. But I want to start, I've shown you all these uncharitable views of liberals and conservatives and religious types and non-religious types. I want to show you some of what I consider to be exemplary actions by people of various religions or not religions. So one of my favorite Christian stories, I guess, would be of the rescues in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, which is a village in southern France. And during the Nazi occupation of France and sort of the Vichy government before that, this village of about 5,000 people, who were mostly Huguenot Protestant Christians in mostly Catholic France, began to sort of rescue any refugees who came to them from the Nazis, including mostly Jews and mostly children, for that matter. And this is actually a school that was run there where a lot of the students were Jewish, and they had fake identity cards. And you can kind of see that fake identity card down there. So the village of Le Chambon kind of collectively sheltered 5,000 Jews throughout this period where the Nazis were trying to exterminate them at great risk to themselves. And when they explained what they did, they always explained what they did in terms of their Christian faith and talked about things like, the 2 commandments are love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. You don't want to be like the priest in the Good Samaritan story who leaves the guy who fell into the ditch among thieves. You want to be like the Good Samaritan who reached out to his neighbor, reached out to the person who was in need. So that's one of my favorite Christian stories. My favorite Muslim story is probably this one. Actually, I have a couple. But this is a similar event, actually. This was the genocide in Rwanda that took place in 1994, where a lot of Hutus, who were the majority, began killing Tutsis, who were the relative minority group in Rwanda. And most religious institutions took part in this genocide. People were herded into churches and they ended up getting exterminated there. But one place where people did not get killed, or very rarely were killed, if at all, was in mosques. So anyone who sought refuge in a mosque was essentially going to remain alive. And the Muslim community, for the most part, refused to participate in this genocide. The Muslim leaders told people not to kill. The Muslims in Rwanda are actually pacifists and refer to a passage from the Quran that they interpret as to kill one person is to kill all of humanity. So played a relatively heroic role in that particular genocidal event too. Favorite Jewish story, I guess, would be the involvement of many Jews in the U.S. civil rights movement. Actually, if you who here knows about the Brown versus Board of Education decision? No one's heard of Brown versus Board of Education? Okay, that was the decision by the Supreme Court that essentially ended segregation, and the decision was influenced by the work of a social psychologist called Kenneth Clark, named Kenneth Clark, black social psychologist, But his actual application to the Brown versus Board of Education was sponsored by the American Jewish Committee in Mississippi in the 1960s. Most of the lawyers who were working, especially on voter registration drives, were Jewish. A lot of rabbis were involved in this movement. And actually, there were some Jewish people who lost their lives as well, including Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner in Mississippi. And then in my favorite Buddhist story would be Aung San Suu Kyi, who not all of you necessarily know. But she is a heroic person among those who know her. The junta, the military junta in Burma had her in prison for a long time. And she said that her Buddhist practice kept her calm. The regular daily meditation sort of kept her going through that time. And she's recently come back into a position of national leadership in Burma. And you probably know about Gandhi, Gandhi's Satyagraha movement in India to free India from British colonialism, using nonviolent methods, which was tremendously effective and became a model for nonviolent movements around the world, including the civil rights movement. And last, I would count as a kind of example of atheism doing good is Chelsea Manning. Not all of you necessarily know Chelsea Manning, although I hope you might have heard about her in the news. She was the one who released evidence of war crimes to WikiLeaks, including what's called a collateral murder video, where American soldiers were kind of opening fire on what turned out to be Reuters journalists. And he released this video and released a lot of other material that sort of showed some of the shady stuff that the US was doing under the guise of classification. And it turns out that he's an atheist. It's not actually very well known that he is. But in some way that plays into, I think, his decision to do this, since atheists often, at their best, are playing a role of exposing the emperor, the idea the emperor has no clothes or the emperor is actually stealing people's clothes. As often people can stand outside of whatever they're told is the right way of doing things, and see something from a more independent perspective. So that's all the good stuff. And of course, it's not always like this. This is not necessarily what everyone's going to get up to from whatever religious perspective or non-religious perspective they come to. So I'm not going to show you all the bad stuff. I'm going to leave that up to your imagination. Please, though, think about what particular worldview you have and try to imagine or try to think about or remember something that people from your own worldview have done that's not particularly glorious, rather than thinking about what someone from some other worldview has done that's not particularly glorious. So that's religious identity, and there's something slippery about this. You're like, well, so what should I be? All of these different religions had some kind of value. They're potentially able to do something wonderful, something charitable, to reach out and rescue people in need, or to stand up for justice in some way, or to expose something that's rotten in the system. But there's also this tendency to go in the other direction, to participate in the things that are oppressive or destructive or violent. And you can do that from pretty much any perspective. So which one do you choose? And political ideology can also be slippery in this way. I'm just going to take conservatives as a starting example. And here's some people from the Tea Party, which is a particular movement, considered a conservative movement. And the Tea Party emphasis is on restoring what they consider to be liberty. So there's an emphasis on the idea that liberty has declined in some way in the United States, and they want to stand up for liberty and stand up for the Constitution. And on the other hand, you have John Ashcroft here, who shortly after 9/11 passed the Patriot Act, which most people from the ACLU or anyone who's sort of like a Constitution watcher from a legal perspective considers a gross violation of at least the Fourth Amendment, probably a few others as well. Even though conservatives might love liberty, or US conservatives might declare a love for liberty, conservative administrations can potentially get up to some very strange practices, do some things that are not particularly conducive or acceptable from a perspective of liberty or freedom. This is a screen from Guantanamo Bay, which is still open even after all these years and commitments to close it. So that seems like it's kind of an irony. On the one hand, there's this pro-liberty orientation. On the other hand, there's behavior like this. But this is something that liberal administrations get up to too. So does anyone know what this is? It's a drone, yeah. So it's a weaponized drone. These drones are doing a lot of killing in Pakistan and Afghanistan primarily, but also in various countries around the world, Yemen. I've heard there are drones in the Congo, there are drones in various countries. And they sort of hover there and fire at people who might be a threat or might not be a threat. Military-age males are usually considered sufficient to fire upon. They might be armed, or they might just look like they're carrying something that might be an arm, but could be a camera. So there's, that's coming from a liberal administration also, so this is not something that is just a problem for conservatives. So one of the frequent theories that's circulated in the media and by others is that part of the problem is the tribalism, this whole like red state versus blue state, Democrat versus Republican, that whole attitude actually generates this bellicose orientation that makes us more likely to fall into these uses of war and other means, and violence and other means, and the solution ought to be unity. If we all kind of came together and everyone was sort of one together, then these sorts of things wouldn't happen as much. And I want to give you an example of something that will potentially leave you skeptical about that. This is some legislation that was passed in 2012 called the National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act has a few interesting features to it. It basically asserts the right of the US government to detain people without trial indefinitely. It also authorizes what's essentially kidnapping, or sometimes called extraordinary rendition, where you could take people and send them to other countries, especially countries that are likely to torture them. And it advocates that any of the people who are detained must be detained by the armed forces. So it has a kind of military state character to it. And you think, this is this would be a very controversial bill. Like, why haven't I heard about this? Didn't really get a whole lot of attention in the media. And in fact, the National Defense Authorization Act that included these clauses of indefinite detention was passed in the Senate, the first vote, 93-7. 93-7. And I just want to point out that the Senate is not 93% Republican. So there's something going on here that doesn't fall into the liberal conservative category. And it's also important to recognize, this is sort of a case of bipartisanship not looking so good. This seems like a kind of predatory bipartisanship or toxic bipartisanship where Democrats and Republicans are getting together, but they're getting together to do something that seems like it runs against the grain of a lot of the values that people would hold dear. And in fact, the people who resisted this, 3 of them were Democrats, and 3 of them were Republicans, and 1 of them was a socialist or an independent, Bernie Sanders. So those were the 7, and they were also balanced between Democrats and Republicans, which is really kind of fascinating. So I look at something like this and I go, this is, everything we're being told about, it's all about liberals versus conservatives. This is an example of something that doesn't really fit into that mantle. And obviously there's some kind of an ideological divide that is happening here. But it doesn't seem to be the ideological divide that we're usually told about. So one of the interesting things is when they took a poll of the people, ordinary people, only about 21% of Democrats and only about 30% of Republicans supported the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 when they were told what was in it. Yet the US Senate is approving this 93-7. So this suggests that there's a real difference between what ordinary people are inclined to value and what people in power are inclined to value, whatever they call themselves. So it seems like the National Defense Authorization Act is something that divides the people from their ruling political class. But this seems like it's an area of ideology, but how do we articulate it? If we don't use the language of liberal and conservative, what kind of language do we use? Because no one really gives us any other language to use. We tend to put everything into those categories, and this seems to suggest that that's not the best idea. So there are other bipartisan mysteries that are very interesting. This is actually some more social psychology. Some researchers called Norton and Ariely asked people, they said, what proportion of the national wealth do you think is held by the top 20%, the top, the next 20%, the next 20%, and the bottom 20%? And they imagined that it was actually much more equal than it in fact was. So people sort of underestimated how unequal it was. And then when they were shown how unequal it was, and they were asked, well, how do you think it ought to be distributed? They wanted it to be distributed very evenly. They wanted it to be distributed actually very much like Sweden, and which is a relatively egalitarian society They have high taxes and very generous social welfare programs. But Democrats and Republicans, you can see these are the Bush voters. This is what they want as the ideal. And these are the Kerry voters. They'd like the top 20% to have more because they earned it to some extent. And the next 20% should have not quite as much. But they still want the bottom 20% to have something. The bottom 20% currently have like this much. So Democrats and Republicans, as sort of ordinary salt-of-the-earth people, have relatively similar views on things like this, and you wouldn't necessarily know this from the kind of debates that you see taking place in the media. This is my other sort of cross-cultural war appeal. Johnny Cash is a remarkably well-liked person on both sides of the red-blue political aisle because he walks the line. So what I really want to get up to with this talk is trying to give us some relatively precise definitions of what's going on here and rooting it in research from empirical psychology that looks at how people are actually using their values, what actually tends to go with what, and then we can get a better framework from which to even talk about these things in a sensible way. So this is Thomas Hobbes, who is actually often considered conservative. And Thomas Hobbes says, it's necessary for any man that aspires to true knowledge to examine the definitions of former authors and either to correct them where they are negligently set down or to make them himself. For the errors of definitions multiply themselves according as the reckoning proceeds and lead men into absurdities. So absurdity is going to become a little bit of a theme here later on. He says you got to get your definitions right. You have to use language in a way that's actually appropriate to what you're talking about. And the question is, do we actually have empirically coherent understandings of religion and ideology? Are we believing something that doesn't really make sense? So we'll start with some of the definitions of ideology that come out of political psychology, and to a large extent, political psychology research mirrors what we hear being said in the media and elsewhere. So a popular definition of conservatism from John Jost and other colleagues who wrote a very influential paper called Political Conservatism as Motivated Social Cognition is that conservatism includes both a resistance to change, resistance to societal change, wanting things to stay the same, maintain old traditional ways of doing things, and also opposition to equality and justification of existing inequalities. So you can see logically why these things might go together in that the current society is relatively unequal. There are always some people who have more power than other people. If you think that society should more or less stay the way it stays, then you're probably going to justify whatever existing qualities are part of that society. And those two things do tend to be correlated, but not nearly as strongly as you might expect. Now, there's another thing that he didn't throw into the mix in this particular paper, but he did in other places, and other theorists in political psychology have brought this aspect of conservatism into the mix, is religiosity. Now, religiosity does not necessarily have a definitive theoretical relationship to either change or equality. There's plenty of material in any religious text that he sort of speaks up for equality, but also will speak up for obedience to existing hierarchies. There are aspects of religiosity that seem very focused on preserving old ways of doing things, but then religiosity, you can find in holy texts these sort of urges to transform things that are unjust arrangements and so on. So this seems like theoretically it doesn't necessarily fit here. But religiosity does have a very strong obedience component. Most people who are religious would tend to agree with statements like obedience is the most important virtue that children should learn. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac, which you see over there on the left, that's actually a painting by Caravaggio, the lesson is that you are supposed to obey God right up to the point where you might kill your own son, if so commanded. So there's this potential link between this obedience, this sort of religious obedience, and this potential, participation in something that's oppressive or violent. And Stanley Milgram, there's a still from one of his videos over there. He did a study with a guy called James Elms in 1966, and they found that people who scored higher on something called the California F scale, which is a measure of authoritarianism, they were more likely to be the ones who shocked the victim all the way to the end. Actually, raise your hand if you've heard of the Stanley Milgram experiment. I would hope the vast majority of you have. Okay, so you guys explain it to the rest of them after class. So there's a kind of link here between this religiosity and obedience, potentially and authoritarianism. So insofar as that's true, religiosity belongs in the conservative definition to some extent. And Jost in subsequent papers has said this. He says religiosity is empirically associated with endorsement of belief in a just world, the idea that what happens in the world is justified. The good people rise and the bad people fall. The Protestant work ethic, that everyone ought to work hard, and if they don't work hard, they don't deserve to succeed. Fair market ideology, the idea that the market produces fair outcomes. The people who get rich are the people who worked hard, the people who are poor, the people who didn't work hard. There's opposition to equality, right-wing authoritarianism, and political conservatism. So religiosity seems like it's caught up in this mix empirically, according to John Jost's study here. So if you accept this, then you have a vision of conservatism that looks kind of like this. It's religious, right? There's a little religious symbols over there. There's a kind of authoritarian resistance to change that's part of it. And there's also kind of hierarchy, violence, and oppression, and that's all part of the conservative package. And so this is sort of what's portrayed as what conservatism is being about. Liberalism, not religious, anti-authoritarian, open to change, equality, peace, rights, and freedom. You might note that this way of thinking about things, we'll just note that there's like a huge wall that divides these two orientations. The idea is that these are, to some extent, incompatible orientations. Everyone kind of falls on one side or the other. But this sounds a little bit like the liberals' view of liberalism. This is not a very charitable understanding of conservatism. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, because as Stephen Colbert has said, liberalism is known to, reality has a well-known liberal bias. This was actually, has anyone seen this video? This is Stephen Colbert addressing the Correspondence Club in 2006 with George Bush. This was a seminal moment in the history of Stephen Colbert's comedy, so look it up later on. It's a very, very uncomfortable video. Nobody laughs. It's very, very awkward, because they're all like, I can't believe he's saying this. But there is a case to which, depending on what particular definition of liberal you're using, a lot of liberals end up in academia because they're interested in looking objectively at what's going on. And so a lot of the time, objective reality lines up with liberal views to some extent. So that's a possibility. But at the same time that that's a possibility, this portrayal of conservatism, to me at least, seems kind of cartoonish and even a little bit incoherent. So if you think of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons as being the oppression and the inegalitarianism, and if you think of Ned Flanders as representing the religiosity, and you think of Chief Wiggum as being about authoritarian resistance to change, these are all kind of different characters, especially Ned and Mr. Burns. One's nasty and the other one's basically a nice guy. So does that all get included in the conservative package? If so, what's going on with that package? Not necessarily because of these reasons, but for other reasons, perhaps. There's a famous social psychologist who rebelled against this hostile portrayal of conservatives. His name is Jonathan Haidt, and I use his theoretical framework in a lot of the research that I do. So Haidt, in 2011, gave a talk that I unfortunately missed, although I was at that conference. And he had about 1,000 people in the room, and he asked everyone in the room to raise their hand and say, raise your hand if you're liberal. And 90% of the hands shot up. And he said, raise your hand if you're moderate. And like another 10 or 12 hands went up. Raise your hand if you're libertarian, another 10 hands go up. Raise your hand if you're conservative, and like 3 hands go up. So he says, all right, well, this is a problem. We have, we're trying to be an objective social science, and about 40% of the country is conservative, and more than 90% of us are not conservative, way more than 90%. It seems like the conservatives are about 0.3% of our group here. And this is a problem. This means we're probably not going to be very objective. We're probably going to make a lot of errors in our judgment of what we think is appropriate to look at and how we interpret our research and so on. So for the sake of scientific integrity, we should invite more conservatives to be part of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. That's what SPSP means. So that's kind of an interesting perspective. And he has a theoretical orientation that potentially matches up with this perspective. And that theory is called moral foundations theory. And the idea behind moral foundations theory is that, you all know we have like about 5 taste buds, right? Or maybe 6 if you throw in MSG. So the idea is that Haidt thinks that we have moral taste buds as well. We all have kind of biologically, evolutionarily designed inclinations to have emotional, moral reactions to certain kinds of violations. Violations of care for others, which include doing harm to somebody, is something that's going to upset most people on a visceral, emotional level because of the way we've been designed, essentially. Violations of fairness, where people are treated unequally or not according to the fruits of their labor or something like that. If they're not being fairly treated, that's also something that offends most people most of the time. And he says there are other ones as well that are out there that are very popular in the world. These are moral foundations you see in all kinds of other cultures around the world, but don't show up so much in Western culture, or they aren't given as much emphasis among the elites of Western culture. And these are violations of in-group norms. So showing disloyalty or not pursuing the interests of your in-group enthusiastically enough, not sort of sacrificing for what your group wants. Violations of authority, where there's somebody who's supposedly legitimate authority and you stand up to them in a particularly rude way. That's something that can potentially offend a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily offend people in the West. And purity, which has both a religious component and also this avoidance of contamination component, where you both want to maintain a kind of spiritual purity. You treat your body as the temple of your soul, and you're concerned about your soul and the advancement of your soul in some way. And you don't want to do things that are disgusting, that will sort of corrupt you, especially things of a sexual or bodily nature. And so he says that these are all taste buds that we all have, but cultures elevate or lower them, depending on what their needs are and what their perspectives are. And you can actually kind of divide cultures up by the way they approach these 5 moral foundations. And he says that, or even within culture, you can see it like United States culture. So what he says essentially is that those who are liberal, they are very concerned with care and fairness. So care and fairness, I don't know how to turn this on, but I would if I could. Care and fairness are these 2 downward sloping lines here. And this is endorsement, this is rejection of any of these moral foundations. Here are liberals over here. So liberals are pretty strongly endorsing care and fairness, but they don't seem to care so much about in-group authority purity. These are these ones here. So liberals care about care and fairness. They don't care so much about in-group authority purity. Whereas conservatives, Haidt says, cares about all 5. They care about all 5, about the same, whereas liberals tend to really prioritize care and fairness and drop in-group authority purity. What comes along with that, though, is that conservatives still endorse care and fairness less than liberals. They do care about care and fairness. I mean, it's above the midpoint. They endorse it, but they don't endorse it as highly as liberals endorse it. And he says, so these are essentially the differences between liberals and conservatives. He gets this data over and over and over again. Who are liberals and conservatives? They're people who call themselves liberal and conservative. So if you write out on a questionnaire, I'm liberal or I'm conservative, this is where you tend to end up on average when you add up all the data together. So that's his alternative perspective of what's going on with liberalism and conservatism. So a little summary of where he's come from. Liberals tend to value purity, sanctity less than conservatives. So the religious stuff potentially matters less to liberals. And a typical purity item here is whether or not someone acted in a way that God would approve of. Does that matter to your morality? And also, liberals don't care so much about in-group and authority. So some items here are whether or not someone actions showed love for his or her country, whether or not someone showed a lack of respect for authority. Those are things that matter more to conservatives than they do to liberals. But liberals value care and fairness more than conservatives. So things like whether or not someone cared for someone weak or vulnerable, or whether or not some people were treated differently from others, these are things that liberals seem to care more about on average than conservatives do. That doesn't mean that if you're a conservative, you can't ever care about these things. It just means that on average, when you add everybody up and you take the mean, this is where they're ending up. This is how they're ending up differently. So what we get here is essentially a model that allows for some kind of polite interaction between liberals and conservatives. And liberals can say things like, well, conservatives, in some ways, you're more moral than I am. 3 of your moral taste buds that I don't use, you use. So, congratulations. And the conservatives can say, well, yeah, thanks very much. And we also recognize in some ways you're more moral than we are. I mean, we care about care and fairness, but you care even more than we do. Congratulations. I'm okay, you're okay. So that's the perspective that Haidt's coming from. And this is a different attitude from the attitude of John Jost. This is a much less hostile and a more friendly attitude that he's promoting between liberals and conservatives. But the definitions are basically the same. So the way liberal and conservative are laid out are not so different from the way John Jost is laying them out and the way other people in political psychology and the rest of culture laying them out. He's just changing the attitude that they should have towards each other. But what I want to talk about here and what separates me, makes my perspective different from both the John Jost perspective and the Jonathan Haidt perspective, is that I think maybe these definitions are absurd. Maybe this isn't really the reality, or this isn't the best way of thinking about what's going on. And that potentially matters. Absurd. Has anyone watched Monty Python? Does anyone know where this is from? Okay. This is from Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. And this is a scene where they are all calling out, here, fishy, fishy, fish. Fish are often sort of symbols of absurdity for reasons I don't fully understand. But there we go. So there's a famous Enlightenment thinker, philosopher named Voltaire, who I hope some of you know at least. And my French is terrible. Does anyone want to read this out in French, what Voltaire said? All right, thanks a lot. That was very courageous. I appreciate that. So the sort of literal English translation of this is, whoever can make you absurd can make you unjust, although this is more commonly known as whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And so I'm wondering if, to some extent, this whole framework by which we think about liberal and conservative is making some of these things possible, making it possible to have Guantanamo, this offshore penal colony where people are being tortured and force-fed constantly, National Defense Authorization Act with indefinite detention, drone warfare, sort of firing people from while sitting in Langley or the Pentagon playing video games. This may result to some extent from being stuck in this liberal versus conservative worldview. So what I'm positing is maybe that this liberal conservative narrative potentially blinds us to what's really going on. As we have one half of people saying we hate conservatives, and the other half is saying we hate liberals, something else is happening that we can't necessarily see. And I wish, actually, I'll tell you what. Why didn't I do that before? All right. Is that better? Mildly better. Except for that part. Okay, went away. Fascinating. All right, great. Let's try this. All right. It'll go back again eventually. There's nothing perfect here. Oh, look at this. We have these things. Let me see these. Does anyone know how to make these things stay? Okay, never mind. Let's try this. This whole talk will become instantly easier to understand. Here we go. Let's try this. All right, that's about as good as we're going to get. That'll go away in a second. So what's possibly going on here, hidden behind the scenes that can't necessarily be perceived, is the people up here representing hierarchy and oppression and whatever, going fa la la, ha 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 ha. Something. We're basically on a really good joke that you guys are not recognizing. And down here in social justice, freedom, and equality, they're screaming. And this isn't necessarily being heard because of everything that's happening in terms of the back and forth between liberals and conservatives. What I'm saying is potentially we're missing this, this hidden story of essentially Godzilla stepping on Bambi. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this particular film, Godzilla versus Bambi. It's a 10-minute film. It's a 10-minute film For 10 minutes, you watch Bambi frolicking, and Bambi frolics and frolics and frolics and frolics, and music plays, and it's really cute. And then the last 10 seconds, Godzilla's foot stamps on Bambi, and that's the end. So that may be something that's going on that we're not paying as much attention to, and there's a sense in which the religious, the non-religious, the anti-authoritarian, even to some extent the authoritarian, are being crushed by this, but they're too busy fighting each other to actually see what's going on. And if this is the case, is bipartisanship the problem or the solution, or both? Because bipartisanship seems like it's happening at the top. Bipartisanship looks like it could happen at the bottom. Might there be some way of using one kind of bipartisanship to take on the other? And I'll be talking about that more as we get towards the end of the lecture. Let me try this one more time. I think I have a third solution. Watch this. The nice thing about books is they have intermediate pages. Yes, there we go. All right. So this is the one-dimensional view of value differences that we see here. And this is what we've essentially been presented with up till now, where the liberal side is extremely egalitarian, anti-religious, anti-authoritarian, anti-oppression, opposed to war, torture, and horror. The conservatives are extremely religious, authoritarian, anti-egalitarian, oppressive, and supportive of war, torture, and horror. And moderates are somewhere in the middle, and there's a dividing line that puts these on either side. I call this a one-dimensional view because a line in geometry is a one-dimensional object. So there's just one dimension that we're seeing any kind of differences on, that we're looking at any kind of differences on. This is an alternative way of potentially conceiving of the way our values are shaped. This is the Schwartz value scale. This has become my favorite scale. I use this all the time now. And Schwartz comes from a perspective where there are two dimensions. One dimension is similar to the liberal conservative dimension, which is openness to change versus conservation. And openness to change is, includes values like self-direction, sort of valuing creativity and freedom, and stimulation and exciting life, and hedonism, pleasure, enjoying yourself, potentially. Whereas conservation is about obedience and humility and devoutness and social order, security, conformity, tradition. And that's the conservation orientation. But then there's another dimension that's running independent, at a 90-degree angle, essentially, from that dimension that I just described, and that's self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. And self-transcendence includes universalism, which is social justice and equality, and benevolence, which is sort of helpfulness to those who are your neighbors, those who are in need around you. Whereas self-enhancement is about your own achievement, your own success, and about getting authority or wealth or power over others in some way. And the idea behind this whole value scale that's presented here is that every value that you see is next to another value is correlated with that value, meaning that people who tend to be universalistic tend to be benevolent. People who tend to be benevolent tend to be, tradition and conformity oriented. People who tend to be tradition and conformity oriented tend to be security oriented. People who tend to be security oriented tend to be power oriented. People who are power oriented tend to be achievement oriented. People achievement oriented tend to be hedonism oriented. People who are hedonism oriented tend to be stimulation oriented. People who are stimulation oriented tend to be self-direction oriented. People who are self-direction oriented tend to be universalist. We just went around the circle. So as you follow these pattern of correlations, you could potentially circle around on yourself. And also that for each value that are sort of opposite on the circle, like universalism and power, they're going to be inversely related to each other. So the more you make your central values that guide your life about universalism, social justice, and equality, the less you're going to be concerned with power and authority and wealth. Those things are considered to grade against each other to some extent. So you can use this value scale to sort of kind of figure out where you can place yourself to understand what your core motivations are. And maybe there are going to be several that you value. Maybe you value universalism and hedonism about equally, and then that sort of centers you in some way in self-direction and stimulation. So you can anchor yourself in some values, and then that'll keep you sort of rolling back and forth between those values, theoretically. So this view is distinguished in that there's no place for a wall. There's no natural division by which you set up one half and say, this is everybody over here and this is everybody over here. This vision of the way values are arranged kind kind of shows a lot of continuity between everyone's values to some extent. Yes, there are opposing values, but the opposing values, you're not that far away from them if you just travel the adjacent values for a while. And the other interesting thing about Schwartz's data is that he got it from 82 countries, thousands and thousands of people who completed this Schwartz value scale. And he finds that this whole division that I showed you here, this self-transcendence versus self-enhancement, conservation versus openness to change, he gets that in 90% of the samples. And the 10% where it doesn't happen, it's almost happening. So these arrangement of these values is repeating itself throughout vastly different cultures. Cultures are differing in all kinds of other ways, maybe in how much they value any of these values, but the arrangement of values is very similar. So he's taken it beyond a Western context to some extent. And if you take a look at these pie slices, they have an interesting odor. So let's smell the pie slices for a little while. The ones that I'm particularly interested in, I'll be focusing on for the rest of the talk, are universalism, which is the social justice, equality kind of stuff. And that smells liberal, right? That's what, the social justice, equality, where all the reaching hands around and part of the liberal package. But the conformity, tradition, humility, devoutness, obedience, that smells like religiosity. That smells conservative in that way. So what's weird is that those aren't so far away from each other on this circle. They're actually, there's only one wedge between them, essentially. And that angle, anyone study geometry? What kind of angle is that? Starts with an A? Acute, an acute angle. So acute angles would suggest a positive correlation. Maybe not a very strong positive correlation, but something. It seems like there might be something there. So if that's the case, then I have a hypothesis that I'm essentially pursuing with this talk. Perhaps there's some link between religious belief and universalistic values that's obscured by the findings from one-dimensional, Western, privileged, well-educated samples. Because that's what most social political psychology research is done with. And that may not be reality. So I want to see if there's some link here between a religion and the sort of universalistic values where they meet somewhere in self-transcendence. So now for some data. I know I've spent an hour just introducing the concepts here. Here's the actual data that I found that is relevant to these questions. So we looked at, in one big data set, and when I say we, I'm actually talking about fellow York College students. We examined 3 variables. In fact, this is a paper that would include Abraham Dickey and Jasenia Pena, who were both at York College, and Bennett Callahan was at John Jay. There's a paper we're now writing up at the moment. We looked at religiosity, which we measured in various ways. Scales that are supposed to measure religiosity is intrinsic religious motivation. There's attendance at religious services. And there's something called the Religious Commitment Inventory. We looked at authoritarian resistance to change. So that's a scale, a very popular scale in the literature called right-wing authoritarianism. And then we looked at anti-egalitarianism and social dominance. And here we used the social dominance orientation scale, also very popular in the literature. And we looked at support for torture because because I'm very interested in torture, since that's been a phenomenon that psychology as a profession, unfortunately, has gotten its hands dirty with in some ways. But also because support for torture is in some ways an expression of social domination. So here are some typical religiosity items, so you know what we're actually looking at. These are things that people responded positively to, or they tended to agree with when they were high on the scale. So they say something like, for intrinsic religious motivation, they could say one should seek divine guidance when making any important decision. The religious commitment inventory would say something like, religion is especially important to me because it answers many questions about the meaning of life. And religious attendance ranges from never to 1 or more times per week. So those are the religiosity items we're looking at. For authoritarianism, we're looking at basically agreement, with some items and disagreement with others. So agreement with something like, our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways and sinfulness that are ruining us. Okay, if that sounds kind of stodgy, that's kind of on purpose by the composer of the scale, Bob Altemeyer. Or agreement with obedience and respect for authority are the most important values children should learn. And disagreement with items like, a lot of our rules regarding sexual behavior are just customs which are not necessarily any better or truer than those which other people follow. So we have a sort of vision here of this kind of traditionalist trying to keep order in the world, and a desire for an authority who can stop all the changes that are messing everything up and take us back to our old ways. That's sort of what authoritarianism is largely about. Social dominance items are things like this. It's okay if some groups have more of a chance in life than other groups. Most people don't agree with that, I can just tell you now. It's kind of a nasty perspective, right? Like, yeah, some groups should rise to the top, others groups should fall to the bottom. To get ahead in life, it is sometimes necessary to step on other groups. It doesn't sound so good either. And disagreement with statements like we should strive to make incomes as equal as possible. So there's this sort of dominationist and this anti-egalitarian component for social dominance orientation. And torture attitudes ranged from torture never justified to torture often justified. So then we've got all these scales, we've got all these ways of measuring things, and we run some correlations. So correlations are just, who here is actually taking a methods class right now? I think some of you are from Professor Pitsakalis' methods class. Okay, have you done correlations yet? Okay, brief introduction to correlations. Correlations essentially tell you if somebody is high on one particular trait or orientation. Do they also tend to be high on some other trait or orientation or not? So correlation tells you about the relationship between two traits or attitudes or values or whatever, or behaviors. And it can tell you whether it's a positive relationship or a negative relationship, as in this particular case, we're looking at, are the people who say they're more conservative, so people who self-report as conservative, are they also more likely than not to be religious, more authoritarian, and more supportive of social domination than those who say they're liberal? And if yes, then the strength of the correlation can tell you how strong this likelihood is. So you can both get a sense of whether it's likely on average that it's in this direction, and then how strong the likelihood is of this going together. So we have three samples. There's the Your Morals sample, which I took from one of Haidt's colleagues named Jesse Graham, Jonathan Haidt's colleagues. A sample from Northern Illinois University, which I owe to a colleague of mine in the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. And then a sample that includes a lot of CUNY students, including York College students and John Jay students. It was part of another experiment that I'll be talking about later, but the experimental condition didn't affect the dependent variables we're looking at, so I thought I could look at that sample as well. So these are the samples that we're looking at. We're saying, do these things actually go together? Are conservatives more likely to be religious, authoritarian, support social domination? And in the Your Morals sample, the answer is yes. Conservatism seems to cohere. The more people say they're conservative, the more likely they are to attend religious services. The more likely they are to be religiously committed, the more likely they are to be authoritarian, and the more likely they are to support social domination. And all of these correlations are pretty substantial. So a 0.3 correlation is considered a moderate correlation, so a moderate probability of prediction that if you're conservative, then you're attending religious services. And things like 0.6 and 0.7, those are considered strong correlations. So it's a pretty strong probability that if you're saying you're conservative, then you're authoritarian and you're supporting social domination in this sample. In the Northern Illinois sample, the more people call themselves conservative rather than liberal, the more they tend to be intrinsically religious. It's a moderate correlation. Be orthodox in their Christianity, which is, we call this a modest, not quite weak, not quite moderate correlation. They tend to be authoritarian. It's also a modest correlation, interestingly. And they tend to support social domination, again, a modest correlation. So the correlations aren't always so strong as they are in that first sample, but they're all positive, as in it's still more likely than not that if you're conservative, that you're going to be all these things: intrinsically religious, orthodox. This is a Christian sample, so that's why Christianity is relevant here. Authoritarian is supporting social domination. And then in the CUNY sample, and I call it the CUNY Plus sample, not because of CUNY Plus, the program, but because there are some in the sample who are not actually from CUNY. The more people call themselves conservative, they also tend to be more religious and more authoritarian, more supportive of social domination, and more supportive of torture. So in these three samples, it looks like conservatism is coherent. It looks like everything actually fits together the way John Jost and Jonathan Haidt would say they fit together. So that's like, oh, okay, well, that doesn't fit with everything I've just been saying. But even though you see that coherence by that particular measure, there are some fishy things happening in this data. So people who endorse social domination tend to be more authoritarian. These are pretty strong correlations overall. They're ranging between modest and strong, and averaging around moderate to strong. So decent, robust correlations between being social dominance oriented and being authoritarian. And people who are more authoritarian tend to be more religious. And again, these are strong correlations, robust correlations. But just looking at the correlations, people who are more religious are not reliably more likely to support social domination. So we're seeing kind of weak positive relationships in the your moral sample. They're significant because they have 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 participants. They're significant, but they're not strong. It's a sort of weak positive relationship. And then there's no relationship in the Northern Illinois sample and no relationship in the CUNY Plus sample. So that's weird. You've got these positive correlations between one variable and another variable, and the other variable and the other variable, and suddenly the correlation is just like they drop off a cliff or something. Or it goes to a zero correlation, meaning that basically these two things are independent the way we're looking at it. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. So the next thing you can do, and this is another trick that all of you who are in research methods should pay attention to. What happens if we control for religious authoritarianism? Sorry, not religious authoritarianism, controlling for right-wing authoritarianism. What controlling for something means is essentially that you divide all the people who took that scale or took that measure up into the various levels of that scale, dividing them up into the people who scored low, and the people who scored in the middle, and the people who scored high. Okay, you look at all of them separately. So in each one of those separate groups, you examine the correlation between two other variables that you're interested in. So you start out by just looking at all the RWA folks in their separate groups, and then you take a look at whether people tend to be more religious, whether people who are more religious tend to be more social dominance oriented. And things could turn out, one way or the other. We don't know. Once you divide it up into groups like that, you might get something kind of different from what you saw when you just ran the correlation by itself. So maybe among high RWA folks, we'll find that people who are more religious are more SDO. Maybe it's like 0.35 or something like that. And maybe moderate RWA folks, we also find a positive correlation. And maybe low RWA folks would also find a positive correlation. If we got something like that, then we can say, when controlling for right-wing authoritarianism, the people who are more religious are more likely to support social dominance orientation. If we got that, that's what we could say. Because at each little level of RWA, when we run the correlation, we get kind of the same thing as in this positive correlation. Do we actually get that? So the your moral sample was so big, we were able to do this. We could divide up people based on their score on the RWA scale, the right-wing authoritarianism scale. So there are people who are very low in authoritarianism. They're scoring between 1 and 1.99. People who are low to moderate, people who are moderate to high, and people who are high. And we look at all these groups separately, and we say, OK, in each of these groups, are the people who are more religious more favoring of social domination and torture or not? And what happens when we do this is we find that for each one of these subgroups in authoritarianism, the more religious people are, the less they support social domination. So this is particularly for the religious commitment inventory and the social dominance orientation scale. All of these are negative correlations. And for the most part, they're modest. They're not strong correlations. They're relatively modest correlations, but they're nevertheless negative. And if you're still not sure what this means, this is kind of what it means. The implication is that the people who are going to be the lowest in social dominance orientation are those who are low in RWA, but high in religiosity. And the people who will be highest in social dominance orientation are those who are high in RWA, but low in religiosity. And that's what you kind of see here. And I have to wander over and shout. So here are all the RWA levels going from low to high. And as you can see, as you go up each RWA level, it gets higher in social dominance orientation. That's the correlation between right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. As you go higher in RWA, you get higher in SDO too. But at each level of RWA, the more religious you are, the less you support social dominance orientation. So at each level, you see this negative relationship between religiosity and social dominance orientation. And that's kind of weird. And that goes against, to some extent, our expectations. This means that religiosity, when considered separately from right-wing authoritarianism, is actually kind of dampening down people's orientation towards social dominance. So we find the same thing if we do it with religious attendance and social dominance orientation. We find the same thing if we do it with religious commitment inventory and torture. We find the same thing if we do it with religious attendance and torture. Always this negative relationship across these different groups. So this is going to introduce you to the idea of multiple regression. Multiple regression does the same thing I just did, or not exactly the same thing, but something thematically similar. But instead of giving you 5 numbers that you have to kind of say something vague about, it gives you a very specific number that summarizes the independent relationship. So that's labeled as beta rather than R. And it tells you the overall direction, the overall strength of the independent relationship between 2 variables controlling for another variable. In this case, it's religiosity and social domination. And as you can see, all of these relationships are negative. All of these independent relationships are negative. So those are our summary values. And so this was all just with one sample, though. Everything I've showed you is just in the yourmorals.org sample. So we ran the regressions in the other samples, too. And this is what we got consistently in all these samples. There's this positive relationship between religiosity and authoritarianism when controlling for social dominance orientation. There's a positive relationship between right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation when controlling for religiosity, and a negative relationship between religiosity and social dominance orientation when controlling for authoritarianism. So that's occurring over and over and over again. This is one of the most robust findings that I'm getting in my research in general over the last 10 years. And it doesn't matter what sample we're looking at, we're still getting that basic arrangement. And it's a weird arrangement, theoretically speaking, especially if you come from a one-dimensional perspective. So we did some other stuff, which is taking this relationship, which is kind of a fun, kooky relationship, and we're like, all right, well, can we mess around with this relationship experimentally? What happens if we put people in this kind of condition or that kind of condition? How is that going to affect the relationship? So we had a society, people who completed this experiment, and some of you might have completed this experiment when you took 102. Who took 102 recently, like 2 semesters ago or last semester?
102 of what?
102 of psychology.
No.
Oh, never? Really? Okay. All right, never mind. All right. So you didn't do this. That's all right. So there are 2 conditions that people could be put into. They could be put into something we call a moral divide condition, or they could be put into a political divide condition. They're randomly assigned to one or the other, and then we check and see what happens in each of these conditions and if the conditions are different from each other. So in the moral divide condition, we tell them, hey, imagine you're living in a society. I don't know, you visit an alien planet or something. We don't actually say alien planet. But imagine, imagine there's a society where you have 2 types of people. There are either people who value care and fairness and in-group authority and purity. And we don't actually say it like that, but that's the general gist that we give them. And there are other people who don't value any of these things at all. Which one would you be? Which one of these people, which side are you going to be on if you were in this society? Because you can't be on the fence. You got to be one or the other. So this is kind of forcing people to make a choice between either embracing all of the moral foundations or embracing none of them. In condition 2, we say, all right, here's a society. Imagine you're in this society. Some people in the society, they value only care and fairness, but they don't value in-group authority or purity. And the other people in the society, they value only in-group authority and purity, but they don't value care or fairness. Which one are you going to be? You have to pick. This is actually a hard one for a lot of students at York College, because at York College, all of these moral foundations tend to be positively correlated. As in, the more they endorse one moral foundation, the more York College students tend to endorse the other foundations. And some students have reported to my research assistants that they're kind of freaked out by the idea of picking between one or the other. Because they either have to kind of give up, in picking it, they either have to give up on in-group authority purity or they have to give up on care and fairness. And then we have them fill out the moral foundations questionnaire to say, which side would be more likely to endorse these items, just to sort of reinforce it. And then we say, OK, now forget everything you just did, and just answer the questions from who you are. Just give your answers based on what you yourself really think. Don't talk about what people from this society or that society really think. Just tell me what the way you are. And then we see what happens. So to understand what we did here, I'm just going to take you back into Haidt's moral foundations theory. Remember that Haidt has this idea that conservatives care about all 5 moral foundations about equally. And liberals care about only care and fairness, and they don't care about the other three. So you can kind of describe this as being like five-legged conservatism, as in they're standing on 5 legs as 5 moral foundations, versus two-legged liberalism, where they're standing on 2 legs or 2 moral foundations. And the common concerns for both of them are care and fairness, as in both the liberals and conservatives care about care and fairness. But what about those people who aren't concerned with care or fairness? We have to kind of include them in our model to some extent, because those people do exist. They're people who don't care about care and fairness. So you have 4 quadrants of potential ideology combinations. You got your 5-legged conservatives, and you got your 2-legged liberals, and then you've got your 3-legged conservatives who don't care about care and fairness, and you got your no-legged liberals who don't care about in-group authority, purity, or care and fairness. So these are the potential quadrants here, and what our experiment is doing in the moral condition is kind of pitting 5-legged conservatism against 0-legged liberalism, or just sort of a general lack of values. Or it's pitting 2-legged liberalism against 3-legged conservatism, where it's in-group authority purity, but they don't care about care and fairness, and the only ones that care about care and fairness don't care about in-group authority purity. So what's that going to do? The political divide condition essentially pits care and fairness against in-group authority purity, and you have to choose. It presents them as being incompatible. So what we find, one of the first things we found is that the correlation between the care fairness stuff and the in-group authority purity stuff goes down in the political divide condition. In the moral divide condition, everyone's like, yeah, care, fairness, in-group authority purity, they're all wonderful. The more I support one, the more I support the other. But in the political divide condition, they start to separate out. The people who support care and fairness don't necessarily support in-group authority purity. And you see this weakening of the correlation is one of the immediate things that happens. And the other thing we're interested in is maybe this sends a kind of subtle implicit message. If you want to be religious, kiss your compassion for the poor and oppressed goodbye. Because if you're going to be in the society where like people are this way or this way, and you're going to stick to the religious stuff, which includes the purity aspect of in-group authority purity, then sorry, you can't be with the people who care about care and fairness. That's kind of the implication. So what's going to happen to the negative independent relationship between religiosity and social domination in this condition when they've been presented with this kind of choice? What we find is it goes away. So in the moral divide condition, where all the moral foundations are like kind of happy together, you find that the more religious people are, the less they support social dominance orientation. So that's this moral divide group here in red. There are negative correlations between social dominance orientation and religiosity in all of these samples. And all these samples are confined to one narrow authoritarian band. These are all people who are scoring moderate levels of authoritarianism in order to control for authoritarianism. So among people who score moderately in right-wing authoritarianism, there's a negative relationship between religiosity and social dominance, and between religiosity and support for torture. But in the political divide condition, this disappears or even reverses. There's either no relationship at all, or in one sample, in sample 1, we actually found a positive relationship between religiosity and social dominance orientation when they were told that essentially that these things go together. So that suggests that our ideologies are very slippery. They're very flexible. They respond to different kinds of information. I might be changing your ideology while I'm talking to you right now. That means that they're not fixed so well a lot of the time. I guess it's especially true at a young age. But there's as you frame things differently, people are going to interpret their ideological inclinations differently. And since we live in a society that's presenting this kind of culture war, liberal versus conservative stuff, that's maybe changing the way we think about what religiosity is supposed to mean, whether it's supposed to go with caring about people or not caring about people, whether it's supposed to go with supporting the oppressed or not supporting the oppressed. That whole narrative may be impacting the way we interpret who it is we think we are. So a little summary so far of where we've come. Conservatives, as dictated by the media and by a lot of research in political psychology, they tend to be more religious, more authoritarian, and more supportive of social domination and things like torture. But if you divide up people by authoritarianism, you look at any specific level of authoritarianism, religiosity implies an opposition to social domination and torture. And if you experimentally pit care, fairness against in-group authority, purity, then this cool relationship that I'm showing you there in the middle goes away. So what does that leave me with, or what am I kind of taking home from that? The first thing I'm taking home is that this one-dimensional liberal versus conservative model, not only does it fail to describe the kind of natural arrangements of values, but it may actually be distorting them, as in presenting people with this particular unidimensional worldview is maybe shifting around values in ways that they wouldn't otherwise shift around. So from a one-dimensional perspective, a negative relationship between religiosity and social domination is bizarre. It shouldn't be like that because it's one big line, and like this is conservatives over here, and this is liberals over here, and the conservatives are religious, liberals are not religious. So they shouldn't be meeting up again at some other end. We could consider this kind of like an incomprehensible triangle where like religiosity is positively associated with authoritarianism, authoritarianism is positively associated with social dominance is negatively religiosity. That's just weird from a one-dimensional perspective. Has anyone seen this before? M.C. Escher? Weird staircases where people are wild? Okay, anyway, also a psychologist, or a psychologically sensitive artist, rather. So everything I've found here, it's not like other people aren't finding this. So I'm not completely alone in the wilderness in finding this stuff. Malka and Soto, actually I'm friends with Ari Malka, he's at Yeshiva University. They found that religiosity and political conservatism measured using variables from Pew polls made opposing predictions of support for torture. The more they were religious, the more they opposed torture, and the more they expressed political conservatism in other ways, the more they supported torture. They also found that religiosity and social conservatism made opposing predictions of support for crushing social welfare legislation. So if you supported crushing social welfare legislation, you tended to be conservative. But if you supported crushing social welfare legislation, you tended not to be so religious. And even earlier than that, religious psychologists, Lath and others, found that Christian orthodoxy and right-wing authoritarianism made opposing predictions of racism, with those who are more authoritarian being more racist and those who are more Christian orthodox being less racist, even though Christian orthodoxy and conservatism tended to go together. So a lot of my early thesis research was on religious tolerance. Are we down to 5 minutes? Oh, give me one there. I started late.
No, you have 4 minutes actually by my clock.
4 minutes?
4 minutes have to eat food.
Oh, okay. We'll take.
I just want to smell the pie, Ian.
Oh, all right. Yes, okay. You can eat the pizza pie too. All right. Let me run through this relatively as quickly as I can. Then this is the Dalai Lama, and now I'm actually blanking on the Desmond Tutu. Yes, Desmond Tutu. I saw them together in Vancouver at UBC, and they were having this really funny exchange over whether or not God existed. And they were just cool with it, laughing with each other, and it didn't matter, He's like, whatever, I'm a Buddhist, I don't believe in this stuff, and he's like, oh, come on, God's all over, So this is like a possible orientation you can have between religious people, and I find that if you control for kind of simple religiosity, the more rigidly conservative people, including authoritarian, dogmatic fundamentalists, they tend to be less tolerant of other faiths, support violence against them. But when you control for conservative rigidity, you get the opposite for religious. The religious people are more tolerant of people of other faiths. They oppose violence against them. Again, you can see this trend for non-religious conservatives are the most, or they're sort of showing the lowest tolerance, still pretty tolerant, but the most tolerant are the religious liberals, those who are religious and also liberal on things like authoritarianism, like low authoritarianism. And I took this on the road for various religions. I'm like, this can't just be for Christians and whatever. And so there was a sample of 10,000 people that I looked at from a BBC sample, and I looked at the odds of scapegoating people for their various religions, and we found that scapegoating was also oppositely predicted by theism, which is a basic belief in God, that negatively predicted scapegoating, and exclusivity, which is the idea that my God is the only true God, that positively predicted scapegoating. And this is happening in every single religion that we're looking at, whether it's Jewish, Hindu, Muslims, even the non-religious were showing this effect to some extent, because some non-religious claim to believe in God. So this was a really, really interesting finding, showing that it's not just confined to the worldviews of the samples from America or the West. And I even looked at sort of the relationship between a country's likelihood of being rated as high in political liberty, and whether or not refugees are fleeing the country. That's usually a bad sign if refugees are fleeing your country. And the amount of military spending per capita and the armed forces as a percentage of the population. And I found that the more a country lacked liberty, the more refugees were fleeing, the less religious it tended to be. And that was in 2 gigantic international samples. So religion seems like it's doing something that's very interesting. And if you look at the people who, most of the countries in the world fall into this category, people who are medium or high in human development. And if you look at those countries and the samples that were medium or high in human development, the more liberty there was, so going from left to right, more liberty, the more religiosity you saw in the population of the country also. And the more refugees that were fleeing the country, the less religiosity you saw in the country. But only among those nations that were medium or high in human development. So again, controlling for human development, you're seeing this. Really interesting study with Pakistani Muslims where they were assigned to a lottery. Because most Muslims would like to go on a Hajj to Mecca, but not all of them can make it, not all of them can get funding. So Pakistan has something where they'll fund certain people who apply, and they get a sort of funded trip to the Hajj, depending on where they come out in the lottery. So you can compare the people who intended to go and those who didn't, and all those intended to go, compare those who actually got to go and those who didn't, what happens to their attitudes. And what they found was that people who are randomly chosen to go on the Hajj became more positive in their views of other countries, more positive in their views of other religious groups, they became more in favor of religious harmony, and they became less opposed to actions like suicide bombing and wars between religions. I skip over some of this other stuff. It basically it fills this whole perspective. So the explanation I'm coming from, I would propose for this general finding is something that's shown in Benjamin Franklin's proposal for the Great Seal of the United States. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And this was something that he proposed in 1776. And the basic idea here is that there is this potential in religion to have this anti-dominationist aspect. There's a narrative in all religions that has this opposition to oppression, and this favorability towards the poor, reaching out to those who are vulnerable. That's a good thing. But on the same time, there's also this obedience orientation, and the emphasis is on obedience to God. And the trouble with obeying God is that most people don't know when they're obeying God or not, because God is kind of abstract, and you don't always know if God's telling you this or telling you that. It's a very difficult thing for people to discern. But it is very easy to know when somebody who is more powerful than you is telling you to do something. So if you've oriented yourself towards obedience to God, people who are in power may kind of step into that position. And so you'll be obeying them instead of obeying God a lot of the time. But you've oriented yourself to obedience, so you're kind of setting yourself up to do that. Insofar as that's the case, then religiosity sets you up for authoritarianism and obsequiously obeying people who are maybe oppressors in your country or causing terrible wars that have no purpose. But if you perceive God to hate injustice and oppression, which is what a lot of religious texts teach, then religious people should also have some kind of discomfort with it too, and these things tug against each other. And I have much more to say, but I'm going to close it there, and we can have some pizza and discussion.
You're all in awe, I see. Well, I'll ask Professor Hansen a question. You always have to be prepared with a question, right? Professor Hansen, where would you put the idea of spirituality in this conversation as opposed to religiosity?
This is a hard one because spirituality and religiosity tend to be so highly correlated that they're difficult to untangle. But I would actually probably characterize spirituality as being the residue of religiosity when you control for authoritarianism. So I would say that when I'm seeing that negative independent relationship between religiosity and authoritarianism, that is the sort of the spirituality component of religiosity that's doing that. Spirituality, and it's sort of like a funny thing to define because spirituality can be defined as being spiritual, not religious, and people often will use the term spiritual in certain, especially liberal cultures, to indicate, I have an orientation towards the divine, but I don't want to go to religious services or be part of an organized religion. But the problem is a lot of people who do attend religious services also proclaim spirituality, and in general, the correlation is strongly positive. The more people say that they're spiritual, the more they tend to say that they're religious. But I think in some way, that remnant of religiosity that you can see within each level of authoritarianism is, I think, the spiritual component that's receptive to a kind of unifying vision of the nature of the universe, and that potentially binds you to other people, including people who are different from you and people who are suffering. And I think that's part of what's going on there.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks very much for your talk. If I'm following you right, it would seem that this bipartisan relationship isn't capturing a lot of what is traditionally thought to be captured between conservatives and liberals. And if you have a power orientation versus a self-transcending orientation in the mix, what predictions would that allow you to make about social engagement around something like an election or a big issue?
Yay! He's just giving me an excuse to show some slides. Can I do that?
In 1 minute.
All right. So I'm gonna run you through here. La 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 la. I think these are all the things I was gonna tell you. Da, 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 da. All right. So you know, basically, here's the pie. The liberal conservative orientation randomly divides the pie here, you know, right along where universalism, you know, goes to achievement and power goes to benevolence. And then it calls all this stuff liberal and all this stuff conservative. What's essentially being obscured is this part, which is what you're talking about. It's obscuring the self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. And your question is, what does that actually predict? What does self-enhancement versus self-transcendence predict about political attitudes? Well, here's what it predicts. First of all, it predicts psychopathy. So the more you tend to be pro-self-transcendence, the less you tend to be inclined to subclinical psychopathy. And the more you support power and achievement, the more you tend to be inclined to psychopathy. And it also predicts things like support for torture. So there's a positive relationship with what I'm calling power elite bipartisanship, which is the self-enhancement. Negative relationship with self-transcendence. Support for war, also positive relationship with self-enhancement, negative relationship with self-transcendence. Support for peace, negative relationship with self-enhancement, positive relationship with self-transcendence. Increasing military spending, positive relationship with self-enhancement, negative relationship with self-transcendence. The death penalty, positive relationship with self-enhancement, negative relationship to self-transcendence. Offshore drilling, which caused a huge explosion, positive relationship to self-enhancement, negative relationship to self-transcendence. Denying global warming, positive relationship to self-enhancement, negative relationship to self-transcendence. Bank regulation, people who are who are strong self-transcenders tend to want more bank regulation. People who are strong self-enhancers tend to want less bank regulation. And we find the same thing if we use Jonathan Haidt's measures for care and fairness. Care and fairness correlates exactly the same way with all these things. Yeah.
We know we're going to have to kind of wrap things up because students have,
Okay.
We know you have other classes to get to. We want to make sure you get some lunch, so we're going to have to wrap it up. Professor Hansen is here in the Department of Behavioral Sciences. Go talk to him. Take a class. Have a conversation. Please, let's thank him for his wonderful speech.